Hello, friends of Euclid. Welcome to 2-4 on indirect proofs. These are like direct proofs in some ways, but they have certain things that distinguish them from direct proofs. And in order for us to understand what those are, first we have to be familiar with some vocabulary, some important terms. One of them is called the supposition. That is the act of supposing, something that is supposed. And you'll see that indirect proof begins with a supposition statement. And you'll see that once we get into this a little bit further. Contradiction. Opposition between two conflicting forces or ideas. A statement that it is necessarily false. That is necessarily false. The statement he is brave and he is not brave is a contradiction. That would be assuming that either he is brave or not brave, and he can't be both. Right? So what basically it covers a wide array of situations where you have two things that can't be true at the same time. You can't be in China and in Minnesota at the same time. So in an indirect proof, you use the contradiction to be able to reach a conclusion about what you are trying to prove. And you'll see how more specifically as we go through this presentation. So what are the steps of an indirect proof? You begin by a statement that assumes the opposite of what you're trying to prove is true. So often if there is a theorem that has a conclusion, and that's the conclusion we want to prove, we'll begin the indirect proof by supposing that that conclusion is not true. Right? So we assume the opposite of what we are trying to prove. And that is a supposition statement. From this assumption, see what conclusions can be drawn. These conclusions must be based upon the assumption and the use of valid statements. So the valid statements will make it very much like a direct proof. You'll be having conditional statements with the next conditional statement flowing out of the previous one, just as you have in the indirect proofs. So that part of it is the same. Search for a conclusion that you know is false because it contradicts given or known information. Oftentimes you'll be contradicting a piece of given information, and that given information is often the conclusion of the theorem, or it might be contradicting the hypothesis of the theorem. So it's information that you know to be true, either from previous argument in the proof or from a given statement. Right, and this may not make a lot of sense right now. We'll do an example or two so you get a chance to see it in action. Since your assumption leads to a false conclusion, the assumption must be false. Okay, so the assumption is that supposition statement that you began the proof with. All right, so then if the assumption, which is the opposite of what you're trying to prove, is false, then you will know that what you're trying to prove must be true. This is often called proof by contradiction, this indirect proof method. It's used a lot in a court of law, where an attorney will try to argue that, according to the evidence, suppose that my client is guilty. Well, then he would have had to be, they will reason through and say, then he would have had to be at this place at this time, where we have eyewitnesses that, and maybe even surveillance cameras that place him across town at the time the crime was committed. Therefore, he could not have committed the crime, so he is not guilty. But that started by assuming that he was guilty, saying he would have had to have been here when the crime was committed. He was not there. We know he was over there instead. Therefore, he is not guilty. So to kind of line it up against the direct proof, you know, in the direct proof, based on this type of syllogism with these premise, conditional statements, if A, then B, if B, then C. If you have more than that, you have if C, then D. Then you have the conclusion, your first hypothesis with your last conclusion. Okay, so therefore if A, then B. Contrast that, well, then we make the conclusion. Contrast that with the indirect proof, which begins by saying, well, suppose that not D is true. So remember that was the conclusion of the conclusion here. So suppose not D is true. That's how we begin the indirect proof. So then we would do similar kinds of arguments. If not D, then E. And we would argue, if E, then F, trying to create this, a contradiction. A contradiction is reached. All right? So this contradiction shows that not D, this, is false, and so D is true. Okay, so we end up kind of rejecting our supposition statement. Think of that example of the attorney that was thinking that suppose he's guilty. Well, he's not guilty because we have a contradiction that shows that he's not guilty. So here we have Mr. Body has been the victim of foul play. It happened after 4 p.m. The theorem is that Colonel Mustard did it. Okay, so what's the beginning assumption? If this is the theorem that Colonel Mustard did it, the beginning assumption has to be the opposite of that. So it is, suppose Colonel Mustard didn't do it. All right, so then we continue on with our conditional statements. If Colonel Mustard didn't do it, then Miss Scarlett did it. And then the next one, if Miss Scarlett did it, then it was done in the dining room. And then it continues just as in a direct proof. If it was done in the dining room, then it happened before noon. All right, well, what does this contradict? Our given information that it happened after 4 p.m. Therefore, this contradicts the fact that it happened after 4 p.m. So therefore, our assumption is false, and Colonel Mustard did it. So this is indirect proof. Important aspects of it. The beginning assumption statement is the opposite of our conclusion from the theorem. Then we reason just as we do in a direct proof until we get to a contradiction. Two things that can't be true at once. It couldn't have happened after 4 p.m. and before noon, both. Then the third piece is that we reject our assumption that Colonel Mustard didn't do it and conclude the opposite of that Colonel Mustard did do it. So that it shows that our theorem that we started with is true. But we did it kind of the back door way, indirect. That's why it's called indirect. We did it by assuming that it's true and then showing that it couldn't have been, assuming that it's not true, and then showing by our reasoning process that it actually is true. So we do it by the indirect method instead. Okay. So what are some of the things you should take away here? In an indirect proof, an assumption is made at the beginning that leads to a contradiction. The contradiction indicates that the assumption is false and the desired conclusion is true. To begin an indirect proof, you start by assuming the opposite of your desired conclusion. So the opposite of the conclusion. Important that you understand that. Then third, when two different propositions cannot both be true at the same time, a contradiction has occurred. And that's when we can reach our own conclusion by the indirect method. Right. You have a geometric day, and I will talk to you later.